How do you encourage critical thinking with the classes that you work with? Now, I don't know about for you, but when I was a student, I really enjoyed when professors, teachers, etc. would ask questions that would encourage me to think deeper, but not do it in a way that was trying to get me to arrive at one correct solution, but instead to go through the process of really thinking deeply about what I was submitting, what I was thinking, or the kind of impact I might have on the world. Because this approach really resonated for me, and I wanted to be able to work with students in a way that helped them to think critically about the things that they were creating or doing or thinking, etc., but to do it in a way that didn't colonize their way of being, their way of thinking, or what they valued. So their ontologies, their epistemologies, and axiologies. One of the solutions that I arrived to was to provide individualized feedback on assignments, reflections, etc., and then providing the option for students at the next class to open it up for discussion to talk about some of the questions that the students had or some of the questions that I posed on their different assignments. So for example, if you're working with a high school class and they're turning in projects that are going to be used by a variety of users in your computer science class, you could ask questions about what kind of users would benefit from this tool and what kind of users would not be able to use this tool because of a lack of accessibility, etc. Or even asking questions like what kind of bias is in the data set that you're using in this app that you are developing, and how might that impact X, Y, and Z populations or demographics. The feedback that I provided on these kinds of assignments and reflections were in the form of questions to get students to think critically about what they were creating in their projects and how it might impact other people. So if it was a game or something, you might be able to ask questions like, how might you modify this project for somebody who only had one hand? Or if you're creating a story, how might you modify this for somebody who is blind? When it came to some of the music education classes that I taught to pre-service and in-service educators in graduate programs, I'd ask questions like, how might you encourage students to incorporate diverse perspectives when iterating on their project? So this wasn't me telling them to think a specific way, it was asking them an open-ended question to encourage them to think critically about what they were creating or how they were going to teach, if this was an education course for education majors. Now, the reason why I would open it up to discussion at the start of the class is because sometimes students were unsure what to think about this and they wanted to talk to their peers about it. So by putting it into a safe space where they could talk with each other and engage with dialogue and ask me follow-up questions, and I would respond in a non-judgmental way, this made it so that there was dialogue going on between the students and myself as the instructor or professor or teacher or whatever. This was a full group conversation and it was completely optional. So because of this, some days it took longer than others. So we might start a class and it might be a 30-minute discussion in a 2-hour class that talks specifically about some of the questions they had on their reflections and assignments, etc. Other days it might only be a few minutes. When we then broke out into project time, etc., I would circle around the room while they were working and kind of ask individuals if they had any questions or anything they wanted to discuss one-on-one. This is an approach that I used in the K-8 classes that I worked with, and this was an approach that I used with university classes that I taught, like the undergrad and graduate courses, because sometimes students weren't able to meet with me during office hours, or I wasn't able to meet with them. Now, when I asked these questions, I was not trying to get them to think my way. I like to think of the questions more like a pebble in their shoes, something they might notice or think about every now and then, and kind of revisit throughout the day or throughout the week, which is an analogy that I learned from the Street Epistemology Handbook, which I'll include a link to in the show notes. Now, this is just one way that I would encourage critical thinking in the classes without trying to colonize thought. But I'm curious, how do you encourage critical thinking and dialogue in the classes that you work with? If you got an idea for how to encourage critical thinking and dialogue in your class, please consider sharing a comment on the YouTube video or by reaching out to me on social media. Which, speaking of, I did get a question on episode 195, which is titled How to Set Up Your Computer Lab, which was also another professional development session where I kind of showed some different ways that you might be able to set up your computer lab. So the question is, what is your suggestion on modifying the racetrack if I don't have any outlets or Ethernets in the center of my room? I have one screen and usually do a 10 to 15 minute quick introduction before we start collaborative work. I had my tables in groups of 6, all facing each other, but that meant that a third of the students had their back to my display. Thank you so much for asking this question. That's an excellent question. So let's talk about it real quick. So the racetrack scenario is what I had in my classroom, where I had some rows on the sides of the wall and then some tables in the center that were facing towards each other. And so you were able to kind of walk around like a racetrack, like an oval racetrack, kind of circle throughout the room. If you want to see a diagram of what this looks like, check out episode 195, specifically the YouTube video, which has some diagrams in it. If you don't have the ability to put computers in the center of the room, my favorite option is actually the donut setup, which I talk about at the end of that particular episode. So it's when all of the computers are facing the outside walls, and that way you can see all of the computers at any given moment. But you can check out that video if you want to see what that looks like. Now, that being said, this person hit on a very important thing. If you are trying to demonstrate something, the racetrack and donut setup is not necessarily the most ideal way to have one-way communication with the students. So if everybody's required to look at a screen, some people might have to turn 180 degrees to be able to look at it, or have to turn their head left and right to be able to look at your screen, and then be able to look and potentially follow along on their screen. This is not ideal. So one of the things that you could do is you could set up a screen on 2 different sides of the room, so that way it's a little bit easier for them to look around. You could even set it up so that you have videos that do a little instruction on the computer itself, so that way it doesn't matter what kind of setup they're going to use. They're able to follow along that way. But a thing that I did with the kinder and first graders was to actually have them sit down in the front of the room at the start of the class for the first couple of minutes, and we'd go through on the screen like what we're going to do for the day and kind of talk through it, and then they were able to disperse and go anywhere they wanted in the room and work with their iPads or on their computers. So those are a couple of different things that you could potentially do for your room setup to make it so that everybody can see the screens. So you can have multiple screens, you could have a video that is on their screen itself, and then you could share that on YouTube and teach more people than you would that you would actually physically be able to see in your class. Or you could have everybody sit in front of the display and kind of like walk them through it as a full group. Another approach that I kind of say with caution that I've seen some teachers use is they took an extension cable, they ran it up the wall, through the ceiling, and then dropped it down through the center of the room. And then they plugged in different extensions and whatnot into that, so that way they could plug in multiple devices to that extension cable. Check with your fire laws and like your codes for your building, and like check with your principal, etc., to make sure that this works for you, because you don't want to do anything illegal with your setup, and you don't want to upset the fire marshal. Another approach that I've seen some people do is they'll actually run an extension cable along the floor, and then you either tape it down with like duct tape, electrical tape, whatever, or you can buy one of those things that on like Amazon or whatever that allows you to put a cable through it, so it's like a runner that goes across your carpet or tile or whatever. Again, talk to your admin to kind of figure out what works best for your setup and your local laws, etc. But there are ways that you can potentially do like the racetrack design and have tables in the middle that actually have some devices on them. Or you could be like, hey, there's tables in the center of the room, kind of like the donut setup, and that's specifically for mobile devices like tablets and like Chromebooks, etc., or laptops. So those are some different options. But if you got some questions on any of the podcast episodes, feel free to let me know in the comments on YouTube or in the show notes at jaredoleary.com. Happy to talk about these in future upcoming episodes, as I might be able to answer your question in a way that also helps other educators out there. If you enjoyed this episode or any of the free computer science, education, drumming, or gaming resources on my website, please consider sharing with somebody else, as it just helps more people find the free content that I create. Stay tuned for another episode next week. Until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.